Hello everyone. So now we're going to talk about the pons. Now when we talk about the pons, I want you guys to remember that the pons has the two surfaces. It has the ventral or basal surface and it has the dorsal surface. Okay, when we talk about the basal surface, if you guys look at the pons, you guys can see that we have the cranial nerves related to the pons. And remember that we said that 1 and 2 related to the cortex, 3 and 4 midbrain, 5, 6, 7 and 8 related to the pons because the nuclei are here, except for the two notochranial nerves. Remember them? We have the trigeminal that has extra nucleus in the medulla, which was the spinal nucleus, and it had the mesencephalic nucleus in the midbrain. Other than that, the vestibulocochlear nerve, it has extra vestibular nuclei in the medulla. Okay, so we have the nuclei of 5, 6, 7 and 8 in the pons, and we can see them in the dorsal surface of the pons. If you guys look at the pons, and pons in Latin means bridge, you guys can see the bridge, and this is actually a very important fibers between the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex, and we're going to talk about them. So these are the transverse pontine fibers. We're going to talk about the story of them shortly. Okay, and then you guys can see that the cranial nerves, okay, so we have, remember we said 1 and 2 here, olfactory is related to the cortex, because today in my teaching, one student told me, please remind us of the cranial nerves. So cranial nerves, we have the olfactory one, the optic nerve, they are related to the cortex, and then we have 3 and 4, we have the oculomotor related to the midbrain, and then we have the trochlear that winds around, and it comes, the only cranial nerve that comes from the dorsal aspect, and then it shows up from the ventral, so it winds around the cerebral peduncles, and it shows from here. And then we have 5, which is the trigeminal. It has a motor and sensory roots. All right, and then we have the abducent, which is number 6, and then 7, 8 are next to 6. All right, abducent nerve, and then we have 7 and 8. This is nervus intermedius. This is related to the facial. It's related to the 7, so we have only 7 and 1 related to it. This is 8, and then we have 9, 10, 11. All right, so glossopharyngeal, and then vagus, and then 11, which is the accessory. They are related to the medulla, as we mentioned in the previous videos of the medulla. And then we have 12, which is the hypoglossal. We already talked about that in the medulla. And this one looks like a clock. We have number 6 up and 12 down. Other than that, next to 6, we have 7 and 8. And down to them we have 9, 10, and 11. So this is a quick recap about the arrangement of the cranial nerves. And like we said, we have 1 and 2 related to the cortex, 3 and 4 midbrain, and we're going to talk about that in the next videos. And then in the pons, we have 5, which is the biggest one sitting on the pons, the trigeminal nerve, the main sensory nucleus, the big one, and then we have the motor nucleus. And the other nuclei, the nuclei of the trigeminal are of course deep inside. We cannot see them here, right? And then we have the abducent number 6 here, and then 7 and 8. Now, we're talking about the pons. So we are talking about 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we're expecting to see nuclei of cranial nerves, all right? And we can see them from the dorsal aspect of the pons. And then the other thing is the middle cerebellar peduncles, because you guys know that the superior cerebellar peduncle is connecting the midbrain to the cerebellum, and the middle is connected to connecting the pons to the cerebellum, and then the inferior are connecting the medulla to the cerebellum. All right, so this is what we can say about the ventral aspect of the gross features of the pons. Now what about the ventral aspect? Now what about the dorsal aspect? Remember that when we talked about the dorsal posterior related to the cerebellum, we have to remove the cerebellum to get into the rhomboid fossa and see what's happening inside. Remember that we talked about the open medulla previously, and we said that was represented by the butterfly shape, and we talked about the cranial nerves related to that. And now we are here. All right, guys, and remember that was actually the core of your brainstem. Remember that was the core of the brainstem, and we said that if we have the core, it means we are expecting to see cranial nerve nuclei and lemnisci. So for me, I can see that here we have all these elevations, and these are made by cranial nerve nuclei. So it makes sense that when we have a core that we call the tegmentum, and this is actually the part that faces the ventricles, the openings that houses the CSF, I would expect to see cranial nerve nuclei. All right, so this is the open pons, and in the open pons we have an elevation, and that elevation we call it the medial eminence. We call it medial eminence because it's an elevation. And down here we have a swelling, and that swelling is what we call the facial colliculus. The facial colliculus here is made by the abducent nerve nuclei, because we have the abducent nerve nucleus. We're gonna see that in the internal structure, and then we have the facial nerve that winds around it. Right, so it winds around the abducent. So if this is number 6, this is cranial nerve number 7, facial. So when it winds around the nuclei means the group of cell bodies of that nerve, and when we have these winding axons around it, it's gonna create an elevation, and that elevation is what we call the facial colliculus. And you guys remember that lateral to this we have the vestibular area. So remember, the vestibular area was showing us superior, inferior, lateral, and medial vestibular nuclei, and I told you guys that the lateral is related to the pons, the superior is related to the pons, so this is superior, so this is lateral, right? And I told you half of the medial is in the pons and half of it is related to the medulla, and the inferior vestibular nucleus is related to this. And this is what we can see from the dorsal aspect of the pons. Other than that, if you guys can see, this is the superior cerebellar peduncle that was connecting your midbrain, because this is your midbrain, all right, and that is your pons, and this is your medulla. And you know that the cerebellum is the roof for the fourth ventricle that is actually between the pons superiorly, all right, and the open medulla inferiorly, and that is your floor, and between the cerebellum, which is basically covering your fourth ventricle, and your CSF is actually swimming in that rhomboid fossa, or rhomboid fossa we call it as because this is, it looks like rhomboid, but if it's closed we call it the fourth ventricle, right? Now, so this is the superior cerebellar peduncle that connects your midbrain to the cerebellum. This is the part of this inferior cerebellar peduncle that is actually connecting your medulla to the cerebellum, and the middle cerebellar peduncle is actually kind of like hugging them, because this is the biggest peduncle, and this is actually, look you guys how big is gonna be the middle cerebellar peduncle. It's gonna hug the both of them, and it's gonna have a lot of fibers, very important fibers, connecting the cerebrum to the cerebellum, because we all the time need to kind of control the movement, and the cerebellum needs to be aware of the movement before your cerebellum decides on what to do, and how exactly the corticospinal tract, corticonuclear, and all the fibers coming from the cerebellum. We need to go ahead and check with the cerebellum, and we need to kind of control the movement. So we're gonna send fibers from the cortex to the cerebellum, and we're going to talk about that in the cerebellum later on, and we're going to see how the cerebellum is connected to the cerebrum, and how these fibers are kind of coming and going between up and down, and that is going to be explained later on. So this is basically your what you can see from the dorsal aspect of the pons. So as a recap, what we can see from the pons anteriorly, so basically this is your pons, the cranial nerves, and your transverse pontine fibers are all the way, and we have here the basilar groove where you have the basilar artery is running on top of that. And from the dorsal surface, you need to remove the cerebellum. You get to the rhomboid fossa, where you can see cranial nerve related stuff. So you have your facial colliculi, you have the medial eminence, you have your vestibular areas, and you have your cerebellar peduncles.